What happens when the greatest threat to a monarchy doesn't come from protesters outside the gates, but from someone seated at the royal dinner table?
Everyone bows and curtsies to the king, and no one moves a limb, a muscle, when Camilla passes. And that was because
King Edmund did not soften the words. He did not ask his family to prepare, and he left no room for negotiation. In one sudden announcement delivered behind the closed doors of Ashcombe Palace, the monarch declared that he would abdicate while still alive. The crown would pass directly to his son, Prince Henry, and Queen Isabel, his wife of 19 years, would retain no royal title under the new order. For several long seconds, she said nothing at all. Then Edmund set the signed paper down on the table between them, and the fictional house of Ashcombe entered the most dangerous hour of its modern history. Edmund had entered the private drawing room that morning carrying a sealed folder under one arm, and Henry had known immediately that his father had not summoned them for an ordinary conversation. Isabel understood it too, though she could not yet have said how. Abdication, in the strictest constitutional sense, meant a sovereign choosing to surrender the throne while still alive rather than reigning until death. Edmund was not raising a distant hypothetical. He was ending his own reign in that room, in that instant, and placing a burden on his son that neither of them had expected to arrive so soon. Isabel did not move from her chair. She gripped its arms and stared at her husband as the weight of his words settled over her. A royal title, she had always believed, was more than ceremony. It was an official identity, duties, protocol, a place in the structure of the nation that had absorbed nearly 2 decades of her life. She had expected changes when Henry eventually became king, as every consort eventually must. She had never once imagined that Edmund himself would be the one to strip her of it. "Edmund," she said quietly, and he did not look away from her. Henry, for his part, felt no triumph. He leaned forward in his chair and asked his father, plainly, whether the decision was final. Edmund answered with a single word, "Yes." The prince said nothing further. An early succession meant accepting responsibility for the monarchy, for his family, and for the generation after his own children, long before he had prepared himself for it. But his father's expression, calm and immovable, made one thing unmistakably clear. The decision had already been made, and there was no version of this conversation in which it could be undone. Edmund opened the folder and admitted, without being asked, that the announcement had not been written that morning. For weeks he had been quietly preparing what the royal household's constitutional office called a transition framework, a formal document outlining exactly how authority, residences, and responsibilities would move from one reign to the next. He had done this work without telling Isabel. Her shock, already sharp, hardened into something closer to hurt. She asked him why her title, specifically, had been singled out, and why he had carried the decision alone rather than discussing it with her first. Edmund closed the folder. He told her there was a separate matter, a harder one, that they would need to discuss privately without their son in the room. Henry watched his father's hand remain flat against the folder's cover and understood, in that moment, that the abdication itself was only half the crisis unfolding in front of him. Something else had happened, something that had made Edmund decide not only to give up the throne, but to remove his wife's title in the same breath. And before the crown could pass to Henry, Edmund would have to explain, to both of them, why the woman who had stood beside him for nearly 2 decades had been written out of the monarchy's future without warning. To the country, when the news eventually broke, this would register as a constitutional shock, the kind of headline event that reshapes a nation's understanding of its own institutions overnight. But inside the family, it was something far more painful and far more human. Edmund was a husband preparing to take something irreplaceable from his wife. Henry was a son being pushed toward a throne he had not expected to inherit for another decade, at least. And Isabel was confronting the possibility that the man she had trusted completely had spent weeks planning her removal in total silence. The crown was changing hands, but 3 lives in that one room were breaking apart in 3 entirely different directions. Edmund remained with Henry after Isabel had gone, and the silence between father and son carried more weight than the announcement itself had. Succession, the formal transfer of a throne from one monarch to the next, was no longer, for Edmund, a distant theoretical concept discussed in constitutional textbooks. It was happening now in this room to this family. He admitted to his son that he believed Henry needed to inherit while his father was still alive and able to guide him through the earliest, hardest years of a reign. That mattered, Edmund said, because Henry would not simply be inheriting a crown. He would be inheriting a divided household, an anxious institution watching its own foundations shift, and expectations heavy enough to crush a prince who wasn't ready for them. Henry listened without interrupting. His thoughts kept returning to his wife, Princess Eleanor, and their two young children, Arthur and Rose. He understood, in a way he hadn't fully grasped until this exact moment, that accession, the formal moment an heir becomes monarch, would reshape every corner of their lives. Public duty would now sit permanently above private routine, for all of them, starting immediately. Edmund looked at his son and confessed something he had never said aloud to anyone. Giving up the throne felt like surrendering the one purpose he had spent his entire life preparing to fulfill. He paused once, then again, before he could finish the sentence, and Henry could hear the grief buried underneath every word his father spoke. Isabel, meanwhile, had already withdrawn to her private study. She unpinned a small enamel insignia from her jacket, a mark of her royal office, and set it down on the desk with more force than she intended. She stared at it for a long moment, wondering whether Edmund had already begun, quietly and without saying so, to treat her as someone standing outside the monarchy rather than beside it. Her anger came from somewhere deeper than status alone. She had stood with him through years of public pressure, scrutiny, and difficult decisions. And now the man she had trusted completely had prepared her removal without a single word of warning. Henry returned to the transition file that evening and noticed something that unsettled him. His father had deliberately separated the abdication decision from the question of Isabel's future status. Her loss of title was not an automatic consequence of Edmund stepping down. It was a distinct choice, written into the framework on purpose. That detail changed everything Henry thought he understood about what was happening. Edmund saw the realization cross his son's face and spoke carefully, choosing each word. He said that love and monarchy could no longer be allowed to answer the same question. Not in his household, not after what had happened. Henry felt a cold unease settle over him. He didn't ask his father what he meant. Instead, he began retracing the past few weeks in his memory, searching for whatever had triggered this. And then one memory surfaced. A formal succession ceremony at Fenbridge Hall, a tense exchange he'd only half registered at the time, and his father leaving the room earlier than anyone had expected. Because the true beginning of Edmund's decision, Henry now understood, had not been the announcement itself. It had been a single evening, 3 weeks earlier, when Isabel had said something in front of the king that he had not been able to let go of since. Edmund remembered the Fenbridge succession review with painful clarity. It was meant to be a controlled, largely symbolic occasion, a private ceremony in which transition protocols were reviewed ahead of any eventual, distant change of reign. Henry had sat beside his father throughout. Isabel had listened carefully, as she always did. Nothing about the afternoon seemed dangerous until Isabel asked, in front of the assembled advisors, that her future royal style and ceremonial standing be formally protected in any future transition. She spoke with real force. She argued that nearly 2 decades of service to the crown should not simply evaporate the moment Edmund eventually stepped aside. The king turned to his wife and asked quietly whether she understood what this meeting actually concerned, Henry's future reign, not her own position within it. She answered that her future could not be reduced to an administrative footnote, dismissed without discussion. The words landed hard in the room. Henry felt the tension sharpen instantly. He understood this was no longer a routine procedural conversation. It had become a question of who would still matter once power changed hands. Henry tried, gently, to calm them both. He reminded his parents that no final decision had been made about anything, least of all this. But Edmund closed the protocol binder himself and told his son, without raising his voice, to leave the room. Henry hesitated, then obeyed. When the door shut behind him, Isabel faced her husband without advisors or courtiers standing between them for the first time in years. Edmund confronted her directly. He told her that her request had sounded, to him, like an attempt to secure influence that would outlast his own reign, an attempt to write herself into a monarchy that wasn't yet Henry's to give away. Isabel recoiled at the accusation and insisted she had asked for dignity, not power. She reminded him of everything she had endured beside him over the years, while he, in turn, accused her of discussing a protected position within Henry's future monarchy before Henry had inherited anything at all. The argument became almost instantly, painfully and irreversibly personal. Edmund left that exchange carrying a decision he had not possessed an hour earlier. According to the private account later included in his own transition file, he summoned a senior constitutional advisor before midnight and gave a single, stark instruction: prepare an abdication framework in which the next monarch would inherit freely, with no permanent royal position reserved for Isabel. The advisor asked, carefully, whether the king wanted time to reconsider. Edmund said no. Isabel would eventually learn that Fenbridge had triggered everything that followed. And when she did, silence would no longer be enough to satisfy her. 3 weeks after Fenbridge, husband and wife finally stood alone together again, and Isabel was ready to force Edmund to say the truth he had been avoiding. She did not enter the room as a queen defending ceremony. She entered as a wife demanding an answer. No advisors, no secretaries, no Henry standing between them this time. Edmund remained beside the table as she closed the door behind her and asked him, simply, to look at her directly. Then came the question that broke through every layer of royal restraint he had built around himself for weeks. Why had he chosen abdication, Henry's immediate succession, and her complete loss of title, all in the same single announcement? Edmund's answer, when it finally came, was devastating in its honesty. He left the signed abdication folder open on the table between them. Abdication meant, in its plainest sense, a reigning monarch voluntarily surrendering the throne, and the folder in front of them contained the full written plan for transferring royal authority to Henry. Edmund understood exactly what this decision would cost. It would not only end his own reign, it would also separate Isabel from an official identity she had spent nearly 2 decades building beside him. And she understood, watching his face, that this separation had not been an oversight. It had been deliberate. Isabel pushed a chair aside, rather than sitting in it. She told him she was not challenging Henry's right to inherit the throne. She had never once questioned that. She was furious because Edmund had tied his own departure to an order that stripped away her royal status in the same breath, as if the two things were inseparable. "Look at me," she said, "and tell me why." Edmund finally raised his eyes to meet hers. Duty had protected him from confronting his own emotions for weeks. Now his wife was forcing him to face the wound underneath the decision, with nowhere left to hide from it. Edmund spoke about Fenbridge. He admitted, for the first time, that the succession review had frightened him, that he had heard her defending a future position within Henry's monarchy before Henry had even become king, and that the fear had never fully left him since. Isabel called that interpretation cruel. She insisted, again, that she had asked only for dignity after years of service, not control over a reign that wasn't yet hers to influence. He answered that the distinction had become impossible for him to hold onto, no matter how many times he tried. Isabel demanded the complete truth, and Edmund gave it to her. After Fenbridge, he admitted he had personally reviewed every proposed future role connected to the household, and he had ordered her title protections removed from the transition framework himself. He had not delegated the decision to an advisor or a committee. He had chosen it alone in the middle of the night, still burning with the memory of that afternoon. Isabel stared at him and asked the question she had been most afraid to ask. Had Henry demanded this of him? Edmund answered instantly. No, their son had known nothing about it. He had neither requested Isabel's removal, nor had any hand in designing it. Edmund accepted the full weight of that decision himself. And somehow, that truth left Isabel even more shaken than before, because there was no hidden rival to blame, no scheming advisor to confront. Only her husband, and a choice he had made entirely on his own. Then Edmund delivered the final, unavoidable piece of it. His authority could begin this change, he told her, but Henry's reign would define what came after. Once their son formally accepted the crown, the shape of the new royal order would belong to him, not to Edmund. Isabel had confronted her husband and finally received her answer. But the more frightening truth Waiting just beyond this conversation was that her actual future now rested with someone else entirely. Henry understood that distinction the moment he was formally handed the transition file. He did not celebrate. He did not immediately call Eleanor to tell her what had happened. Instead, he sat alone in his study, rereading the same paragraph twice, then a third time. His father's abdication would make him king. But hidden inside the machinery of that succession was a far harder responsibility, deciding on his own whether Edmund's demand regarding Isabel would survive into his own reign, or whether he would quietly begin to undo it. He opened the file again. The transition framework was, in its simplest terms, the written plan explaining how duties, authority, residences, and official roles would move into a new reign. Edmund had begun the process, but Henry, once he formally accepted the crown, would still have to shape the household that followed. And that single decision, more than almost any other he would make in his early reign, could define how the country understood him before he had truly begun. Compassion, handled carelessly, might look like weakness. Firmness, handled without care, might look indistinguishable from cruelty. Eleanor found him still reading, long after the household had gone quiet for the night. Henry closed the file and admitted to her that he refused to begin his reign by punishing Isabel for a family wound that had nothing to do with her stepson's fitness to rule. Eleanor understood the fear underneath his words immediately. She reminded him, gently, that rejecting revenge did not have to mean rejecting his father's judgment entirely, that there might be a version of this that honored both. Henry looked away. He could protect the institution his father was handing him, or he could appear, in the eyes of the country, to be quietly resolving an old family wound through the machinery of the crown. He feared, more than almost anything else, that the public would never fully separate the two. He turned back to the section concerning Isabel, and noticed a signed declaration attached behind it that he hadn't seen before. Edmund had written in his own hand that the no title instruction belonged to him and him alone. The king had accepted full responsibility in writing, stating plainly that his son had neither requested nor designed the decision. The wording, Henry realized, was deliberate. His father was protecting him in advance from any future accusation that he had engineered Isabel's fall before he had even inherited the throne. That protection unsettled Henry even more than the decision itself had. He requested a private meeting with his father the following morning. Edmund listened as his son asked whether he expected the instruction to be reversed after accession, the formal moment an heir becomes monarch. Edmund didn't pressure him either way. He simply said, "I expect you to understand why I made it." Henry studied his father for a long moment and understood there would be no easier answer waiting for him, no matter how long he searched for one. Eleanor later watched Henry reopen the file on his own. She saw him pause over Isabel's name, then rest his hand flat against the page without turning it. He still hadn't decided.